You are listening to Everything Environment by Mongabay-India. Welcome to our show, Imprints. I am Sahana Ghosh, contributing editor at Mongabay-India. In this episode, we hear from Atreyee Bhattacharya, a paleoclimatologist. Paleoclimatologists look back at past climates to develop the context for understanding recent climate change. This aids in predictions of future climates. Using the knowledge, they can work with policymakers to mitigate negative outcomes. Atreyee's work takes her to lakebeds and libraries. She analyzes sediments drilled from old lakes and scours British archival records to reconstruct past rainfall changes. Peering through hundreds of pages of archived, digitized British records, letters, and maps, never seen by anyone before, Atreyee looks at past instances of disasters, such as floods, droughts, and famines. She is excited as new information on records of famines in Maharashtra, going back to the last 200 years, come up, because this record will help her reconstruct what happened in the past as rainfall fluctuated. But despair cuts through her excitement. We've not learnt any lessons from the past. Maharashtra has always been water-stressed. Despite that, it's been intensively farmed and more thirsty crops are being grown. But there are reasons to hope. With these time capsules, Atreyee is able to partner with economists to shed light on policies that can turn a climate variability into a climate disaster. A recent research in collaboration with natural resources economist Gaurav Arora has shown that famines in southern India in 18th to 20th centuries were caused by not extreme but minor rainfall fluctuations. This kind of research, she hopes, will act as a guidebook to influence policy so that people who produce our food, farmers and fisher community, are protected from climate shocks. Let's hear from Atreyee. So, hi Atreyee, welcome to Imprints. In my introduction, I introduced you as a paleoclimatologist, and it's quite a mouthful. So now let me ask, what do you do as a paleoclimatologist? Why do you call yourself as such? And how did you end up being a paleoclimatologist? Was that a conscious career choice?
First of all, Sahana, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure doing a podcast. It's the first time I'm actually doing a podcast, so we'll see how it goes. How did I become a paleoclimatologist? I just don't know this. I have no idea how I ended up here, except that I know this thing, that I was trained as an earth scientist and then I was doing my master's. And at that time, this was early 2000s, I was really not motivated by sort of the, skill-based approach of learning that was there. Like you learn this, you learn this. And most of the time, I didn't really know why I'm supposed to learn this and how this matters. And this was true in Presidency College and IIT Kharagpur for the longest possible time. And I was doing my master's at IIT Kharagpur and really not feeling very motivated. In fact, I was going to be a journalist after that. And then we were forced to basically listen to seminars. And there was a seminar at IIT Kharagpur by very eminent scientist, Dr. S.K. Bhattacharya from Physical Research Laboratory. And he spoke about using isotopes to reconstruct monsoon strength over the last millennia or something like that. I think that was the moment I decided that, this was very cool and that I wanted to understand past climate and understood that it is these kinds of studies, learning the past climate, that tells us what is the present in the context of the larger history of Earth. So I think that would be the pivotal moment when I decided that I would study Earth's climate, and much later did I realize that it is called paleoclimate. So that's how I became a paleoclimatologist at the brink of wanting to leave a discipline. This is what has kept me going for the last, several, at least more than a decade, actually more, a couple of decades at this point. As paleoclimatologists, we reconstruct past climate. Paleo means past, climate means climate. So we reconstruct at different resolutions the past climate history of the Earth. And that's broadly the discipline of paleoclimate scientists. So we use different kinds of tools, different scientists use. Some of us use, measurements, different kinds of geochemical primarily, but also biological proxies. Other scientists use that to reconstruct climate history. And there is also a modeling component that people use to reconstruct past climates. So all of these would fall under the larger umbrella of paleoclimate.
But tell me something. Why do we need to do this? Why do we need climate research? And the reason, I'm asking this question is how does it tie in with what we should do as human beings on this earth so that we make our existence and our environments also stable? So, to sum it up, how does paleoclimate research link to what we are currently doing, our actions on this planet? Could you elaborate on this?
So I think it's a very good question. I would almost argue that without paleoclimate research, we just wouldn't know that we are in a climate crisis. Paleoclimate research is sort of the cornerstone, the backbone, the spinal cord, however you want to call it, that first and foremost told us that we are in unprecedented times. So without the study of the past, about 4.6 billion years, give or take, is the Earth's history, paleoclimate record goes back to almost 540 million years. And that encompasses the entire climatological and environmental history of the Earth. And it is only in that context do we know that today is an aberration in all of that time. So without paleoclimate research, we would not know where we are. So I would say that climate research started as paleoclimate research. Much before the word paleoclimate came into being, Earth history is how we know under what conditions different kinds of life evolved, under what conditions different kinds of life went extinct, mass extinction events. We know about evolution, but we also know about the climate background under which these things happen. So I would argue that without paleoclimate research, there is no climate change. It is only climate change because we know that it is a change of unprecedented magnitude and unprecedented pace. So Warren, the famous American poet, said that history cannot tell us what to do, but it can give us a blueprint of what are some of the risks associated. I'm paraphrasing him. And I think this is what paleoclimate research does. It doesn't tell you that do this or don't do this, but it does give you a very good idea about conditions under which human society has progressed, conditions under which human society has not progressed. And it also tells you what are the environmental sort of triggers that we need to be aware of as human societies, because these are long running sort of variables. They're not like pandemics. They take forever. In human imagination, it's forever, but it's quite quick in nature. So I think this is the most important. I would think of all climate sciences. Yes, it doesn't have a predictive power, but it tells you under what conditions, what are the suitable conditions under which human society has prospered, and under what conditions human society has not prospered, under what conditions life has evolved, under what conditions life has not evolved. So it's sort of the guidebook, I would say, to future rather than the sort of what to do and what not to do, which is the realm of climate predictions. So that's what we do.
Now I want to know is what are the questions that you are trying to ask and what is it that you are trying to get a response to in paleoclimate research?
So, the primary goal of my research is to understand and reconstruct rainfall variability. And using that, we can also reconstruct whether there were phases when rainfall was lower than a certain threshold value for X number of years. So, those are the things that we can get from the kind of work that I do with natural systems, particularly lake sediments and geochemical analysis of lake sediments. When we think of disasters, disasters are not natural phenomena. Disasters are only words that we use in the context of human, some kind of negative impact on the human society. So a drought is basically low rainfall. When that becomes a disaster, or whether that becomes a disaster and what capacity, is really about how our socioeconomic system and eventually cultural and political systems are associated with the expectation of a certain amount of rainfall every year at a certain time. So one part of my research, which is based on natural archives, geochemical analysis, that basically reconstruct the variation of rainfall and also in that process, we can find out whether there were periods of long time when rainfall was lower than a certain amount or lower than the average. Disasters are something that we don't find in natural archives. To understand that, we go to human archives. I study British archive, British institutional documents to reconstruct a record of disasters independently. So we record disasters of all kinds. Sometimes disasters can be because of a war. Sometimes disasters can be precipitated by rainfall reduction, but becomes a disaster only when certain policies continue to operate without taking into account the reduction. So that's the human archival data. In my case, I look at British administrative documents. And then when we lay that information on top of this very independent record of rainfall variability, we start seeing interesting information about, is there a threshold at which, if below which, if rainfall reduces, our current or the past economic socioeconomic policies, did they become a disaster because they were not cognizant or did not quite appreciate the degree of rainfall variability? So the disasters would be slightly different, but rainfall and drought, and whether at what point that rainfall and drought variability becomes a disaster, is something that I study by these combining two sets of independent information.
When variability becomes a disaster, that is what is the crux of what you're doing. Now, you have a substantial amount of field work under your belt, and you've described, about these semi-arid landscapes where you do your field work, especially in Maharashtra. Could you sort of take us through your fieldwork experience? Where is it that you go exactly, and how do you select these places in the first place? And if you've got a toolbox, what are the tools in your toolbox that you're using while you're on the field?
So yes, the field, which I've not been able to go for the last 2 years thanks to the pandemic. But I look at lakes. I look at old lakes. Sometimes these are natural depressions. Sometimes they are natural depressions which have been walled off to make reservoirs. So these are old techniques of harvesting and using water in semi-arid landscapes, not just in Maharashtra or southern India, but across most of the Indian Ocean region. So I look at lakes. I find out lakes that have mentioned in historical documents, both British documents and older. And we go there and do a combine. So these kinds of studies where you want to understand, how the lake system evolved over time. It's not one tool that can give you any of these answers. They're incomplete by themselves because these are systems that are natural, not just purely natural or man-made. They're a composition of both. So what we do is first deploy remote sensing to sort of see what the recent history of the lake is. Then we also deploy geophysics. A colleague of mine, Sudipto Sarkar, he's at ISER Pune. He is my colleague in remote sensing and lake geophysics. So we also map the bottom using different kinds of geophysical tools. And we understand sort of the sediment pile. And then we go and take out cores. These are, tubes of sediment, the top one being the youngest, the bottom one being the oldest. We go and what we call core lakes. So we take out these 1 to 1.5 meter cores using different kinds of coring techniques, gravity coring, vibro coring, different in how much they can penetrate, what can be recovered. And then we take these to the lab back in the US and the University of Minnesota, which specializes in these kinds of, core analysis. And we split it right down the middle. And once we split it down the middle, you can sort of see history visually that the top of the core was the day you collected it. And as we go down, it goes basically back in history. So then we basically go ahead and date these cores. We apply three different kinds of radiometric dating, carbon dating, cesium 137. So that's what we do. And when we compile all of these to understand, when did these sedimentation rate change, whether it was climatologically controlled, whether it was biologically controlled, whether it was human controlled, and then can reconstruct a sort of not just a climate history, but sort of a landscape history, which is modulated both by climate as well as human activity. So this is the kind of field work where we do. The other kind of field work that I do, it's not field, but it's also archival work in which we go and look into documents, British documents, institutional documents in regional and national archives. And we look at minute papers all the way to reports and extract information related to mention of floods, droughts, or disasters.
But in addition to COVID-19 impacting fieldwork, what were the other challenges, or what are the other challenges in paleoclimatology? Is there something which is really bothering paleoclimatologists when they're working in India?
Well, I think several. For example, currently getting international work funded, collaborative international work funded is hugely challenging. And that is making scientists of different countries work in their own sort of, within domestically. And that changes how effectively we can collaborate, across different disciplines, across different countries. So that's a major game changer, I feel, that's ongoing. So I think, what do we mean by collaborative science? Can we do field sciences? A lot of times people, I used to be a field going paleoclimate scientist, but currently a lot of my focus is sort of on modeling and, statistical modeling because I'm not able to go out in the field. So with these kinds of, as COVID-19 sort of evolves and stabilizes, I think impacting fieldwork has been a major problem in this field. In the past 2 years, I don't think people have been able to go out in the field and do any meaningful work. So the repercussions of this are going to continue. So I don't know what the solution to this is, but I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see severe impact on fieldwork, at least international fieldwork. I mean, over the last 2 years, we have been hardly been able to go to any of the archives because earlier we used to be able to go to the archives and work long hours and go into the map room and see what maps are there. During the pandemic, this we have not been able to access the archives at all. So we rely on digitization by archivists to do these things. And while there are several archivists who have made documents available free of cost, very easy access, I do think that one thing that needs to be done is that archive can basically, digitize everything and make it available. Because last 2 years we have not been able to go to the archives either. So all of the work, basically all the data collection has stopped. It's basically right now, gazetteers or secondary information that we are mining, which is in a way fantastic because it's comprehensive, but it's not raw data.
While the problem of a pause in data collection or data mining efforts sounds really serious, but on a lighter note, I was curious, did you have any aha moments when you're sort of going through these archives, right? When you're going through these documents, which are hundreds of years old, and you come across some information and you think, oh wow, this is really cool. And what I have is something which I really need to understand a bit more. So, have these aha moments also come in your work?
I guess the answer is all the time. I think the aha and the moments come when you actually create both these records and superimpose them on one another, and then the aha moments really come when you analyze. But also, these documents are really cool. I mean, some of these have been written 200 years ago, never seen by anyone. And then you see that, people are talking about the same things as you're talking about now. So I think working in the archives have been quite fascinating for me. It's not been an area where I was trained formally as a graduate student. I learned it later. And I think archives are sort of digging into the past and looking at letters and minutes and reports and maps. And then you see the problems that we are talking today were not just today, they were there 200 years ago as well. And you almost think that we have not learned any lesson at all. There are cool moments and there are also despairing moments, I would say.
As you said, working in these archives has been really fascinating. Could you give us a glimpse of what was so fascinating in terms of your findings? What were these interesting findings you've been able to uncover during all these decades of work, all these interesting things? But could you give us a bit of a summary of what these findings mean and what these findings exactly are?
I mean, all of the interesting findings are documented in papers, honestly. So, yeah, I mean, one of the things I think instead of like this aha moments, I think what has been sort of a deeper understanding is that today we know that semi-arid regions are water stressed, and we think that it is present day climate change, when in fact it used to be far more water stressed 200 years ago, simply because we were in a different climate regime altogether. We were in what we call the Little Ice Age, and today, if we think of Western India or Southern India, if monsoon doesn't arrive on the 1st of June or 5th of June or whenever that is, we start panicking. But in these documents, you often see instances of failed monsoon for 2 seasons. And those are eureka moments. You're like, and people survived somehow. And but they didn't survive. There were wide scale social disruptions, deaths. And as soon as that famine would be over in the next 5 years, things would go back to the same old, same old. So I often find that, all of the problems that we talk today have been around not just for 50 years, but for 200, 300 years, 400 years. And we somehow tend to think of these problems as problems of the past just because we changed the language of discussion around it. For example, Maharashtra. Maharashtra today is water stressed, but it has always been water stressed. And the last 1,000 years, it has always been water stressed. And yet, every time you see every epoch, we have seen it more intensively cultivated, more and more water, thirsty crops being grown, simply because Maharashtra is connected via Bombay as an important port. And therefore, trade, commerce, and economic decisions always sort of driven the market in a direction which is front loaded, in the sense that there is rainfall variability here. Rainfalls do fluctuate quite often. And every time it fluctuates, there is a famine. And you have a 200 record of famine and you see nothing changes. It only becomes worse. So these are some eureka moments that nothing that we are seeing today is new. But yet we continue on this path of sort of market driven sort of decision making, which ultimately makes any variability into a disaster far more quickly and far more effectively.
You've made a very important point about this path that we are on, where our decisions are so market driven, right? And which, in a way, sort of transforms a variability into a disaster far more quickly. Now, what I'm trying to get at is taking off from all this research. How does your work inform policy? And in addition to policy, can it inform planning so that, we understand the impacts of climate variability better and can adapt to these variabilities better?
That's the point where I feel actually better about things, because I work very closely with a natural resources economist, Gaurav Arora at IIIT Delhi. And this is where we basically take the recent past and sort of the contemporary and see what are sort of the main drivers. Like on top, there are differences. I mean, what was 200 years ago is very different today. I mean, there was very different kinds of technology then, very different kinds of technology today, different policies then, different policies today. But what we do is basically try to understand the pivotal components of problems of today. And we have found out that, water stress, food security, access to ports, whether that's a port today or whether that was a port 200 years ago, has been sort of the most important issues driving famines and disasters. So, in this way, when you develop methodologies, pretty much analytical methodologies, in fact, we are currently drafting a paper on this methodology, is that when you are able to not just say, this is not a contemporary problem, this has been around for 200 years, and these are sort of the systematic and institutionalized issues that causes climate variability to become a climate disaster. And when you do that, then you start influencing policy, hopefully. So we are more inclined to basically think about sustainable policies and implementation, because these are too big for farmers to do on their own. Farmers will obviously want to sow a crop that fetches them more money in the market. It is up to the policymaker and the administrator to come up with policies that are more sustainable and protects farmers, rather than asking farmers to make a change in a direction that doesn't give them the money that they need. So we tend to focus on using such research to draft or inform policies that are more sustainable in the regional context. And we hope that that method actually might be helpful for or protective of frontline workers, farmers, fishermen who provide our food. So this is where I think a new kind of research is emerging, where climatologists who look into the past partner with economists interested in not just 10 years of data, but a long term running variable kind of thing, and use that to say, well, here is the evidence. And we need to come up with policies that are cognizant of this and protective of our frontline workers and food security. That's the place where I feel hopeful. If we know these things, can we work with policymakers, governments, so that we do not encourage policies that have only backfired every time and is going to backfire severely as climate variability increases, more droughts become common, and there is more pressure on natural ecosystem services? Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely does make sense what you're trying to emphasize here. You're saying that climate mitigation needs to be fair and just. But can you give us a few examples of how this just pathway is? Are there examples of inequity in climate mitigation? And on the other end, what a sustainable policy or a pathway could look like? Could you give us an idea of what that might be?
Today, Maharashtra gives subsidies for solar powered, ways of extracting water. Now that's great. And the argument often is this is going to mitigate against the climate change. True, maybe from the energy aspect, but giving that and allows farmers to extract water from a limited supply, and that availability is also sort of marked by caste, gender, age, position in society, all of that. And what ends up happening often is rich farmers become richer and poor farmers become poorer. So this is the kind of policy. Well, on one hand, yes, solar powered pumps are great. You can have water, whatever. But again, this policy is not working for, poorer farmers. And when they cannot farm the land, they basically go out to the city, which has its own sort of migration thing. So Gaurav and my work is primarily to understand climate migration and the role of policy and climate in that. So this is just one example that we are looking into currently. But there are several such examples across the country, the northern part, in the southern part, and sort of even desert areas. So if we are to solve this problem, the policy is really the only way to solve this. There's no other way.
And one thing that I want to go back to is in our earlier conversations, you've spoken to me quite a bit about a paleoclimate research database that's coming up. So you've been talking about a group of people coming together to put up this database in addition to you. Now, how is that going? Can we access that database, or what level is the work at now?
We are hopeful that this database is, first of all, in our country, we don't have access to data. So, say an anthropologist wants to compare oral history against an independent record of rainfall, that person will not find that data anywhere, or will have to go through great trouble trying to locate the author and request the data and so on and so forth. So, one of the things which is not true in many other countries. So, what we wanted to do was create a database that has a section for scientists, like people like me, who need other data to benchmark their own new data against, and the other one is for stakeholders and eventually for teaching, that we want to create products that different kinds of people need. A planner will not look at isotopes, but they may want to look at what is the rainfall history of the region, so they may want to know in millimeters. But all data is available in very different metrics, so there's a job in converting all of this data into what we call usable measures. So the database first will give access to data to researchers, which enhances their research output. We also expect to use the database to create products that are usable by planners, decision makers, policymakers, even farmers. And then we also hope that we'll create teaching modules that NGOs working at the interface of community and science can access and use that to work with their own community members. We call it a teaching module, but it's not necessarily classwork teaching. It's more about sort of addressing that, there's a lot of good data science that scientists produce that are not just for entertainment, that's for use, but creating modules that allow people to get trained in how to use the data and information. So these are the three aspects of that database. The first aspect is currently what we are working on, but we are also sort of developing methodologies to see how we can convert the existing data into usable data. So it's a mammoth work. First part is done. The second part is in the progress, and the third part is a dream so far. But hopefully we'll get funding to make that dream possible.
Thanks, Atreyee, for helping us make sense of our current challenges, and also for explaining, for unpacking how this kind of a research, can contribute to effective solutions, and how can we take it ahead in terms of implementing on the ground. So thanks a lot, Atreyee, for spending time with us on Imprints. In our next episode, we will hear from someone who finds clues in mollusk shells. Please subscribe and share our podcast, Everything Environment by Mongabay-India, with your friends and family. This episode of Imprints was hosted and produced by me, Sahana Ghosh, co-produced by Karthik Chandramouli, and edited by Tejas Dayanand Sagar. Cover art by Karthik Chandramouli and copy edits by Sapna Verma and Priyanka Shankar.